Thank you for coming. My name is Bruce Calkins, lead for the Mellington Seminar Series. And this week we are delighted to have Dr. Scott Lathrop from Sortech. It's a local company, but he's not local, so he had to fly in this morning, so he just made it from BWI in Baltimore. And we're so glad you made it, and hopefully going through Atlanta wasn't too hairy for you, because we all love going through Atlanta. He is Sortech's Director of Cyber and Secure Autonomy, and he delves a lot into artificial intelligence, cyber, human factors, and all the stuff that we love to do. So we're going to have the same brief actually to our emergency cyber issues, my class, a couple hours today. So thank you for the double duty and to talking about his background. Before he came to Sortech, he retired about a little over a year ago from the U.S. Army. Spent 28 years, 26 years. Retired as a colonel, and his last job was at U.S. Cybercom, so he really knows what he's talking about. And like myself, he was a functional area 53, which is your information systems manager in the Army, and one of the few that were selected to go to Cybercom, especially at that early when they were really building things and building their workforce and trying to really get into what their jobs are now that you see now. So without further ado, Dr. Lathrop.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, University of Central Florida, for inviting me back. This is actually my second talk here. I did another one about a year ago, so I figured I must not have messed it up too bad, otherwise I would never have been invited back. But it's an honor to be here. I have a lot of respect for this university, both when I was in the military, seeing the types of research that you all do, and how it ends up in some of our, especially our simulation products. But then also being a member of SOAR Technology, the company I'm with now, we have a lot of UCF grads, and so I'm hold all of them in very high esteem, just based on what they do for my company, Sortech, each and every day. When Bruce asked me to come down and talk, he said he really wanted me to focus on a couple things. One was just cybercom in general and cyberspace operations for the Department of Defense, based on my experiences that Bruce articulated. I spent 4 years at Cybercom, starting in 2011. I really helped build that command. I worked strategy and policy. I led our research and development efforts there, and really got to interact with both commanders, General Alexander and Admiral Rogers, quite frequently. So I really got to see kind of high level what they were thinking and where they wanted to take the command. And I also got to interact a lot with the folks at the Department of Defense level who were working the policy issues and the strategy issues, and also the R&D issues when I was in my research position. So really got to see a lot of how the department was thinking about cyber and where we were going. So a lot of this talk is from that perspective. And then what I thought I'd do for the second part of the talk is dive a little bit into one of our science and technology objectives, which was in the areas of modeling and simulation. And what I thought I'd do is kind of present what I've seen in modeling simulation cyber since I started working in this space back in the late 90s, and then talk about where I see some of the gaps and how I think AI, artificial intelligence, can help fill some of those gaps. Again, these are based on my personal perspective and experiences. With all these talks, it does not reflect the views of the Department of Defense. And I say Cyber Command, National Security Agency, yada, yada, yada. Everything I pulled into this talk, I pulled off of open source, so the figures come from Wikipedia or Joint Pub 3 TAC 12, which is our joint publication for cyberspace operations. Well, obviously, we're not going into any kind of classified discussions in this talk. If you have any questions at any time, please don't hesitate to ask. I'd rather this be more interactive than me lecturing. I have 18 slides. We have 1 hour. If I get through all the slides, great. If I don't, that's fine too. I don't really not tied to that. So why did the Department of Defense get involved in cyberspace operations, and why did we create this, or coin the term that cyberspace is a domain, a warfighting domain? Well, it really stems from the evolving threat and the fact that our software is very vulnerable. And every time I present this slide, before I presented it, I was thinking on the plane ride down here, I mean, I could be updating this slide on a daily basis because every time you open the news, there's a new threat or a new attack. If it was ransomware last week, this morning I was reading an article on an attack on Bitcoin in one of the emerging countries. So a theft of $1 million is what was reported. So every time we talk about this, we realize the threat is still there, it's not going away, and our systems aren't any more secure despite all of our best efforts. But a couple of examples that I have here which really highlight the fact that these threats are evolving from what originally was more of a disruption to now actually being more destructive. And it's destructive not just of our cyber systems, our IT systems, but also destructive in the sense of our physical systems. And so a couple of examples of that: in 2012, the Saudi oil and gas company, or Arabian Oil and Gas Company, they were hit by a virus called Wiper. That virus destroyed 30,000 of their hard drives. And you may say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, the big deal about that is that you think about it, most of our nation's wealth is now stored in the form of information. So the wiping of 30,000 hard drives is very significant. In 2014, of course, the hack against Sony, which wasn't necessarily destructive in the sense of physical sense, but destructive in terms of that company's reputation, and also really pushed the U.S. in terms of how we were going to respond. There was a lot. I remember at the time there was a lot of discussion about how are we going to respond to that, because that attack didn't affect the national security posture, but it affected a company, and it affected the reputation of that company. So there's a lot of discussion about how do we respond to something like that, and how do we deter in cyberspace. And then more recently, in December of 2015, we saw this attack against Ukraine, where it was actually an attack against a cyber physical system, in this case, electric power generation. And so what happened there, an attack against their system, which basically knocked out 200,000 people. 200,000 people in Ukraine, they lost power. The substations were down for up to 6 hours, and the only way they were able to restore those substations was through actual manual configuration. The automated systems at that point were deemed worthless. They were basically like, yes, sir.
So since you're talking about security, you're going to bring up anything about offense, like with Stuxnet and attacking the Iranian?
I'm only going to bring it up in the context of training, per se. But one of the reasons why the military coined cyberspace operations as a domain is not just from a defensive perspective, but also from an offensive perspective.
The classified levels really limit us in that. I mean, as soon as you start talking about it, it goes very high on classified.
What we can do, though, is talk about what is cyberspace from a U.S. Department of Defense perspective. And really, the key points I want to bring out here is that it's not just the internet. We often think of cyberspace, at least the layman's version of cyberspace when we first started talking about this, was that it was the internet and the systems that are connected to the internet. And in reality, it's really any kind of computational device, whether it be embedded or a general purpose computer that has some kind of connectivity to another computational device. And so we see that on internet systems, obviously, but we also see that in other types of cyber physical systems, or Internet of Things is the buzzword. So automobiles now are basically computers on wheels. A lot of the appliances in our homes obviously have computational processing power and are connected to the internet in some way or another. And so really cyberspace is this collection of computational devices and the communication between them. That communication doesn't necessarily have to be TCP/IP, it could be any form of protocol. One of the key points that I want to make about cyberspace, so when we're writing Joint Pub 3 TAC 12, which is the Department of Defense's doctrine for cyberspace operations, we talked about cyberspace not in terms of just the computational devices and the connections between them, but we also talked about it in terms of the physical hardware itself, which has physical attributes such as a geographic location. But we also talked about it in terms of the folks that are actually using those devices, what we call the cyber persona layer in that publication. And really, at the end of the day, these attacks that we see, there's a human behind them. There's not just, it's not, even though a human may push a button and that button may have some form of autonomy or some form of automation, there's a human that's thinking and acting and making decisions that's causing these end effects. And so we talk about cyberspace in terms of these three layers. One of the claims we made in that Joint Pub 3 Tech 12 was that cyberspace was man-made. Whereas with the other domains the other warfighting domains that we talk about, land, air, sea, space, we typically talk about it as being physical domains that are not man-made, that they're there naturally existing. I personally think we made an error in calling cyberspace a man-made domain. There was actually a really good discussion on this by Dr. Denning out at Naval Postgraduate School, who talks about the fact that the land domain is not is a man-made domain in the same sense that cyberspace is, because we have the only reason why we fight in that domain is because there's physical terrain to take. There's land, there's buildings, and there's the man has actually built weapon systems to fight in that domain. And so the same can be said about cyberspace. But oftentimes people will talk about cyberspace as being man-made, and so it's unique from the other domains in that sense. That's something I think that's open to discussion. It's actually an interesting discussion, and we could probably talk about that for the next hour. But it's something that we claimed in the Joint Pub 3 Tech 12 that I'm personally not satisfied with, because we could make that claim about all the warfighting domains. So to get back to your point, sir, cyberspace operations is not just about defending our networks, which really was where a lot of the focus was from an IT perspective, but it was also about using cyberspace to create effects for warfighting operations. And so when we think of it from a Department of Defense perspective, we are thinking of cyberspace both from a defensive and an offensive perspective. And other countries think of it the same way, at least the ones who are actually working in this area. Okay, so the U.S. Cyber Command. U.S. Cyber Command was an organization that the Department of Defense created in 2009 to really combat some of these threats that we were seeing. Across not just Department of Defense networks, but across national critical infrastructure. And so those threats that we alluded to earlier are just, again, examples of some of that. Cyber Command was what we call initial operational capability in October of 2009, and then reached what we call full operational capability, basically meaning it could stand on its own in May of 2010. What's interesting about Cyber Command is that it's a joint command, and so what that means from the military perspective is that it's made up of folks from all the different services: the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. And so there's people from each of those services represented throughout that command. And the commander of that organization, first commander was General Alexander, an Army general, and the current commander is Admiral Michael Rogers, a Navy four-star admiral. They are also what we call dual-hatted. They're the commander of the United States Cyber Command, and they're also the director of the National Security Agency. So they have to fulfill both roles. And there's currently some discussion about that, which I'll touch on in a second. Underneath Cyber Command, you have four service components, which are service pure organizations that are subordinate to U.S. Cyber Command. So you have Army Cyber, which is the Army's service component that works for U.S. Cyber Command. You have Fleet Cyber, Air Force Cyber, and Mar Force Cyber for the Marines. And each of those have numbers associated with them that really is not that important, but those are where really the services come into play. What else is interesting about this chart? So this chart I pulled off of Wikipedia. It's really not up to date, to be quite honest, but it's good enough for this discussion. The other interesting thing about Cyber Command is it's currently, it was when it was built and still is what we call a sub-unified command. And so what that means, it's subordinate to another combatant command called U.S. Strategic Command. And that is interesting from a couple standpoints. So Bruce was, when I was at Cyber Command, Bruce was at U.S. PACOM, another full combatant command, which is responsible for the Pacific region. Each of the 9 combatant commands that are in the military have specific geographic regions which they are responsible for, except for 2 combatant commands. U.S. Transcom is responsible for the entire world's transportation assets to support all these other combatant commands, and U.S. SOCOM, Special Operations Command, is responsible for apportioning special operations forces to the different geographic combatant commands. U.S. Cybercom was looked at as another unified combatant command, or a combatant command at that level, and those discussions have been ongoing, but at this point in time, it still remains what we call a sub-unified command to U.S. STRATCOM. So actually, STRATCOM is the third combatant command that actually is not tied to a specific geography. It's just a global asset for the military. So one of the issues that this raises, and that's been raised over the years now, is the fact that because the commander of U.S. Cybercom, wearing his U.S. Cybercom hat, reports to another 4-star STRATCOM wearing his U.S. Cybercom hat, and as the Director of National Security Agency reports to the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense, there's really this conundrum in place, because on one hand, he's reporting to these high-level officials wearing the NSA hat, and on the other hand, the individual is reporting to a subordinate commander. So sometimes that would raise some interesting conversations and issues. So a couple of the issues that have been raised over the years, and which continue to be raised on that organizational structure, first is the need in cyberspace to have a rather rapid response. So a lot of times, something might happen, and the need for the commander of Cybercom to make a rapid response is necessary. And so one of the arguments against this organizational structure is that commander has a lot of layers to get through to actually get to the Secretary of Defense and the President to receive the authority to do something. Another argument against this organizational structure that's been raised is just the resourcing. So a lot of times, when you have an organizational structure like this, the funding goes to that top layer, right? And then from there, it gets kind of piecemealed out to different layers. And so by the time it gets down to an organization like Cybercom, the funding has been diluted somewhat. And so the priorities of what Cybercom may consider priorities and the priorities of what U.S. STRATCOM may consider as priorities could conflict.
So that's an issue with the vertical hierarchy. What about with the horizontal? Do they share information well, or is there going to be another failure like with 9/11 where the intelligence agencies weren't really coordinating what they know?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the reasons why Cybercom is co-located with the National Security Agency is to facilitate that information sharing. The challenge with that is you start running into resourcing issues, for one, because the National Security Agency is being funded by through the intelligence community, and Cybercom is being funded through the Department of Defense through these different layers. And so you get this kind of big brother, little sister, or little brother, however you want to, analogy you want to make, right? Big brother, little brother type situation where big brother is getting a lot of funding and little brother's not, and so you run into conflicts as to who can actually call the shots, who can do what. There's also issues with what we call Title 10 and Title 50 authorities. So Title 50 authorities are, this is USC Code Title 50, which the intelligence community has, and so they have a certain set of authorities and what they can and cannot do. And under the Department of Defense, U.S. Cybercom has what we call Title 10 authorities, which gives U.S. Cybercom certain authorities from a warfighting perspective that the intelligence community might not have. And so that would cause conflict sometimes, because you could do certain things under Title 50 authorities that you can't do under Title 10 and vice versa. So that's where some of the conflicts come into place with that structure. But yeah, I mean, the goal going forward is obviously to support the information sharing. But one of the arguments right now that's being made is whether or not that commander of Cybercom and the director of National Security Agency should be split into two people. And that conversation is being had simultaneously with the conversation to elevate Cybercom to what we call a fully unified command. So it would be at the same level as a PACOM, the same level as a STRATCOM. But yeah, I mean, anytime you split an organization like that, there's going to be some challenges with the sharing of information. Yeah. Will it result in the same fiasco? Let's hope not, but I don't know.
Sir?
Yes.
To what degree is Cyber Command reliant on civilian organizations for operational support?
Yeah, good question. So, within Cybercom itself, within the headquarters, it's made up, like I said, of military, of all four services, plus government civilians. There has to be, there is some contractors, obviously, that support that, and they're civilian contractors. And they get involved in things like development, running networks, some things that you may not consider a military function, for lack of a better word. Where you have to be careful, and this is where some of the issues between the National Security Agency and Cybercom being kind of co-located and working for the same boss, is that you know, there's certain things you do as a warfighter wearing a military uniform that you don't ever do as a civilian, because you're not given that authority or responsibility. So that's where you have to be careful into how much you're resourcing that military command with either civilians or with civilian contractors.
So then is it Cyber Command's goal to be completely independent of that civilian network of support, or to integrate it further?
You can never be completely independent. I mean, even a warfighting command like PACOM, or even when I was a tank company commander, a lot of our third and fourth level echelon of support were civilians. It's just the folks that are on the front lines who are pulling triggers or who are defending that area, if they're an air defender, they've got to be wearing that military uniform. But a lot of the support functions, like logistical support functions, yeah, that can be either contracted out or a civilian workforce to support that.
So, sir, I was a SAW gunner at the 27th in Hawaii. What is the discrepancy between being a trigger puller versus someone who's maintaining the integrity of the network? I'm not sure I see a clear line of demarcation between those two functions, at least in relation to these computers.
Yep. So when we talk about, think about what I'm saying here, but when we talk about the 5 Ds, we typically talk about, in terms of creating an effect, deny, which it's deny, disrupt, degrade, destroy, but really they're all deny, they're just temporal, right? Deny for a few seconds is disrupt, deny for a longer period of time is degrade, and destroy is deny forever. So I always think of it just as deny with temporal effects.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah. So whenever you think of creating effects, then a military member is at least from the U.S. perspective, is necessary. But defending a network, especially where we're going, I'll talk a little bit later, from more proactive defense, sometimes when you're hunting on your own network for adversary activity, hunting like, looking for bad activity on your network, that may also require a military person, just because it could be a military network and with military proprietary data. So that might be another situation where a military member would be responsible, but is from a defensive mechanism. Yeah. And if you think about like soccer, right? In soccer, sometimes the defense informs the offense, and the offense informs the defense, and sometimes you're playing defense and you switch over and you're playing offense. The same could be true in a cyberspace operation.
So there's clear policies then about when a civilian can take certain action within a certain context of some kind Network intrusion.
Yes. Yes, it's very clear policies. And authorities. Authorities, actually. And then the policies follow. Let's see, what else about this chart? So we talked about kind of the dual-hatted nature and the fact that over the years, there's been talk of elevating cybercom to unified command. That talk is now, again, elevated. It's again in the news. I saw it in the news the other day. They're talking about elevating cybercom to unified command. Another interesting tidbit about this, our emblem as cybercom, is these numbers here, which you can't make out, are actually the bit string for our mission statement. It's a hash, MD5 hash, our mission statement. It's interesting tidbit. So there were 5 things when we were looking at the strategy for cybercom that we were working with the commander at the time, back in 2011, that we really were focused on. And this, General Alexander talked about this a lot in the public, creating defensible architectures, which feeds into our science and technology strategy. I'll talk about that. Situational awareness in cyber is still something that I haven't seen no one's figured it out yet. And what we mean by situational awareness, for those who have not been in the military, is situational awareness, or situational understanding is the other buzzword people use, is really about knowing yourself, knowing the adversary, and knowing how the adversary can create effects against you and how you can create effects against the adversary. So as a tank company commander, one of the things I always wanted to know was, how was the enemy approaching me? Where were they? Where did I think they were currently located? And what combat power did I have to apply against them, whether it be my own tank company, air assets that I might be able to call in, artillery, and so forth. That's situational awareness, understanding your surroundings. In cyber, it's been very difficult to get our heads around situational awareness because most of us, the computer geeks like myself, we think of it in terms of a network map, right? A network map that gives us situational awareness of what machines are running, what machines aren't running. But if you think about cyberspace in terms of those 3 layers, physical, logical, and cyber persona cognitive layer, really situational awareness needs to encompass all those layers. I mean, right now, we focus primarily on that logical layer. So most situational awareness tools you see right now are network maps, which give you kind of a nice picture of the logical layer, if they can scale. That's another issue with those. They often don't scale, right? Because when you're talking millions of nodes, or you're talking the entire power grid of the U.S., it doesn't scale real well. But that's just one part of situational awareness, right? It's also, what is the adversary doing, and how are what's my what we call critical terrain or critical cyber assets, right? What machines are the most important? Is it my machine that runs, my small company, is it my machine that runs pay? Is it my machine that runs contracting, or those apps that run contracting? Or is it actually the software that we develop is sitting in our repositories? That's what we need to kind of figure out from a friendly perspective. And then be able to have tools that show that. So situational awareness was a big thing we were looking at. Defensible architectures. And then more on the operational side, command and control. So one of the things was, from a command and control perspective, how do we organize so that we can support commands like PACOM, but also maintain tactical control of our forces? Because cyber is, one of the things about cyber is you can't really pin it to a geographic location, right? An attack that is against our networks could come from right next door, right? It doesn't necessarily have to come from another country. So how do you command and control in cyberspace when you have these, at least the way the Department of Defense is organized, these different geographic commands who are responsible for different geographic regions of the world? So that was one of the things we were struggling with. So situational awareness, defensible architectures, command and control, authorities and policies, which gets back to some of the discussion we were having previously. What are the right authorities that Cybercom needs to do its mission across all aspects of cyberspace operations? And then what are the following policies that support that? And then the last one, which is what I really want to finish the last half of this conversation about, is trained and ready cyber forces. That was a big thing that General Alexander did over and over again. All that other stuff doesn't really matter unless we have forces that are trained and ready to do what we're asking them to do. And since cyberspace was and still is such a new warfighting domain, at least, we were struggling to figure out, what does that force look like, and how do we train them, and what types of ranges do we need to train them, and what types of modeling simulation tools do we need to train them, and so forth. And so we solved some of those problems, but we still are struggling with others on the training aspect. So one of the things we did is we said, well, we can't just have these headquarters. So when I showed up to Cybercom in 2011, I looked around and I said, okay, we've got Cybercom, which is a headquarters. We have Army Cyber, which is a headquarters full of people who do in military staffing functions. They do planning and resourcing, but they don't, they're not actually the ones who are moving cables and configuring software and so forth, right? And you had Army Cyber and Air Force Cyber, and it's like, I'm looking around like, where are our maneuver forces? Like, coming from the armored cav world, where are my tank companies and my tank platoons and my infantry squads? And they didn't exist. So we created this construct called the Cyber Mission Forces, which really are those maneuver forces for cyberspace. And this is really where we started thinking about how do we maneuver in cyberspace? How do we organize ourselves to maneuver in cyberspace? And so this is what we came up with. It's not a perfect model, but it's what we have for right now. And so we came up with these different teams, National Mission Force, and this, again, I'm pulling right from public sources, so this is just what's already out there. Combat Mission Forces, Cyber, and then what we call Cyber Protection Forces, or Cyber Protection Teams. And they each had kind of a different role. National Mission Forces is responsible for defending the nation in cyberspace. And so this gets at what happens if there's an attack against our power grid, or what happens if there's an attack against Wall Street. Who's going to respond to that? It also ties into our authorities and policies, because one of the discussions that was going on at the time was, well, you're creating a cyber command, but all they're really supposed to do is defend the Department of Defense networks. And my boss kept saying, well, that doesn't make any sense, because the Department of Defense doesn't exist to defend the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense exists to defend the nation. And so there's this continuous conversation about, well, what is the role of cybercom in defending the nation? We continue to use the analogy of, if we're being attacked in the air by another country, we're not afraid to call the Air Force to intercede. Well, wouldn't we do the same thing in cyberspace? And so that took some time to get that through, from an authorities and policy perspective. But I think we're at the point now where people understand, yes, cybercom and these cyber national mission forces are responsible for defending the nation in cyberspace. That's what their role is. Combat mission forces are there to support combatant commands. So there were a certain number of combat mission forces that allocate or apportioned to U.S. PACOM, where Bruce was at, and those teams were responsible for supporting that combatant commander's warfighting efforts, supporting the warfighting plans and supporting any kind of contingency operations that might occur. And then the cyber protection forces were really where we looked at consolidating a lot of the stuff that was going on, a lot of the different missions that were going on at the time to defend our own networks that wasn't really well organized. And so what I mean by that is there were certain teams across the different services who were doing things like red team, or what we call adversary emulation, where you're trying to penetrate your own network to test its defenses. There were certain activities such as vulnerability assessments, right? Teams going out and looking at the vulnerabilities in networks and compliance in networks and so forth. And so what we did is we really just consolidated a lot of those functions into this cyber protection force. So now each of these cyber protection force, there's 68 teams. Each of those teams are made up of what we call, we didn't call them squads. I can't remember what we call them, but I think it was like smaller squads. So we had within the cyber protection team, we had a red team that was responsible for emulating the adversary against our own networks or penetration testing. We had a team that was responsible for compliance, so doing things like vulnerability assessments against our networks. And then one of the cutting edge, cutting edge concepts that came out of this, which maybe it wasn't cutting edge if you were on the inside at the time, but I think it's cutting edge and starting to catch on in the industry, is this notion of hunt, or this what I call counter reconnaissance. So actually, assuming that the adversary is already in your network and actually taking proactive measures to hunt for that adversary within your network. So looking for things like indicators of compromise. For example, if you have a specific malware sample that you're getting through threat intelligence, going to look to see what that malware does, and then, for example, if it modifies a file on your system, going to look for systems on your network, specifically those that are critical assets, to see if that file has been modified, or that registry key, or so forth. And so this is where you really get into the notion of soccer, where you might be playing offense 1 minute and playing defense the next, or you might be playing defense and you might need some intel from Title 50 authorities to tell you what to go look for, what to go hunt for. So hunt teams, I think, were very cutting edge as part of the self-protection.
Scott, I know it varies, but give them an idea how big are each of these teams?
Good. So each team,
It shows you how big this thing is. It's not just.
yeah. So this total force is about 6,000 people. If you add up all the people on these teams in each of the teams, each team is approximately 30 to 60 people. I think this is not the right number. This is about 30 people on each one of these teams, and these teams are about.
Some one's very big. It looks like 39 or something.
Yeah, 39. Yeah, 39 was the cyber protection teams. I don't remember what the numbers were on those teams, but it was somewhere around between 39 and 50 or 60, something like that. It was less than 100, I know that.
So to piggyback on the earlier question, when I say the word force, I think that those are all active duty. Are these teams all military personnel? So
it's a mix of military and civilians, government civilians. There are no contractors on these teams. There are, to get back to your question, there are on the support teams, which is where a lot of the back-end Intel analysts sit, and then a lot of the software developers. There is contract support that's augmenting these teams. But these teams are military and government civilians. And the government civilians can only do certain functions on those teams. And that really comes down to a lack of, well, there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons why it's a mix. Part of it, though, is training, is trying to get everyone up to a standard.
The civilians don't rotate, so you can.
Right, so they have more consistency across those teams. Whereas the military are rotating more, although there were some discussion of having more stable policies in the military for these types of teams.
Is one of the reasons for that mix a lack of available personnel to fill those roles within the military, sir?
Right. I mean, that was part of the discussion. There was that, and there was a lot of other discussions of why I ended up with a mixed government military.
Also, you got to remember, this is a joint command, so when they fill these slots, they have to ask the services to send them by. They may have an authorization, but they may have an authorization for 5 Air Force people. Air Force may only be able to send them 2 for whatever reason, because they're trying to build their own Air Force cyber forces as well. And when the service looks at things, I won't say they all do this. My experience was if a service says, okay, I got to fill a joint billet versus one of my Air Force billets or Army, put your service name there, guess what the priority is going to be? It's going to be the service. So, yeah. But this was big enough to where the services were told by people above them, okay, you need to stop that and get serious about this.
So that's no longer an issue anymore, sir?
Okay.
It's less of an issue than it would be if for other things. Let me put it that way. It's always going to be an issue everywhere because the services are always told to cut back, and because of people moving, going to schools and everything, there's always a lag. You can't just make up authorizations or bodies or something like that. So there's always going to be an issue, but it's less of an issue, I think, than cyber just because of the importance of it.
Yeah, and it requires a lot of training to get these folks at a level that, I mean, coming from an armor cab background, I could probably make the argument that it's a lot easier to train someone to shoot an M1A1 tank than it is to do what we're asking them to do in a cyber, one of these teams. It just requires more training and education.
A year now for some of these guys.
What's that?
It's like over a year now for some of these guys.
Yeah, I mean, the training pipeline is actually, it's closer to 2 years. They usually spend about a year with their service, and then there's another year that they have to go through. In some cases, like for software developers, you're talking a 3-year pipeline. just to get someone up to a basic level. And so this is where really, you know, we're looking at the modeling and simulation community. We need help. And that's really what the second part of this talk is about, is what do we need to do on the modeling and simulation side. Yeah, before I get to that, so this is just when I was running R&D, this was kind of what we came up with from on an unclassified level of our science and technology needs. And it goes back to having operational architectures to support maneuver in cyberspace, which comes down to things like, you know, how do we create more agile networks so that we can reconfigure them on the fly dynamically. So this gets into things like software-defined networking as an example. Capability development architectures gets into being able to rapidly retool capabilities to help defend our networks. Command and control, so this gets into situational awareness, right? What are the right tools for situational awareness? What are the right tools to, you know, how do we communicate between these cyber teams? A lot of people are focused on training individuals, but then you got to think about training the teams, and then you got to think about training the teams to, you know, the intra-communication between those teams, which is where some of these mission management or command and control applications come in. And then modeling and simulation, which gets back to, you know, what I said originally when I was looking at this, is we've got to create realistic environments that don't just focus on the logical, which is where we currently are at with cyberspace ranges, but also focuses on the physical and cyber persona layers. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a second. So, modeling simulation for cyberspace operations to train these cyber mission forces. If you look back at the history of where we've come with building ranges for cyberspace, it really all started from the DEF CON events where they had these capture the flag events back in the mid-90s. Where really, if you looked at it, it was really an unconstrained attack defense, right? You had, and they still do it this way at DEF CON, right? You have folks trying to break into other folks' boxes, and you're trying to defend your box at the same time, right? And it's really small teams, it's unconstrained typically, and the services that you're attacking aren't realistic in the sense that you're not really attacking a Windows email server or a Apache web server, right? It's just made up, not made up, but they're just services that people build with explicit vulnerabilities in it to see how you do attacking and defending. So a group of us in 2001 at the military academies and the National Security Agency started talking about, well, how do we train our future officers in this space? And so we created this thing, this was the time I was a professor at West Point, we created this thing called the Cyber Defense Exercise, where we wanted a more constrained environment from what we saw at Capture the Flag. And so what we decided to do was have the exercise focused on defense, and we had the cadets or midshipmen provision their networks with real services. So they had to have real, you know, working email servers running and web servers and so forth. And then the National Security Agency's red team would play the adversary and try to break into the cadets or midshipmen's networks while they tried to defend them. And so this was good from the sense that we were able to evaluate the exercise much more easily because it was a little more constrained. But some of the shortfalls of that work was really the only traffic on the network was either, you know, very little user traffic and then the traffic from the red team. There really wasn't really good network traffic generators at that time. And so, you know, looking back at that now, it was pretty easy. I mean, once we figured it out, it was pretty easy to defend against NSA's red team on that kind of network. In fact, I remember my last year, this was 2003, running that exercise before I moved on to another military assignment. We were, like, NSA basically couldn't break in because we knew right where they were trying to go and we were able to counter it right away because the only traffic coming was basically their traffic. So that got to be a little bit too unrealistic at that point. Since that time, they, you know, brought in more realistic traffic generators and tried to incorporate more user play, but there's still challenges there. If you look at 2003, DoD issued this IO roadmap saying that we want to, you know, increase the level of realism in our networks. We want to have integrated EW cyber ranges, and we want to focus on not just defending, but also attacking. And that's what the 2003 DoD Information Operations Roadmap said they wanted. Well, if you look at that and you go back and read that material, it actually sounds very similar to what they're calling the persistent cyber training environment now. It's almost the same requirements. But unfortunately, what came out of that really wasn't a whole lot, in my opinion. It was, they built this thing called the Joint I/O range, which in roughly 2006 timeframe. And what came out of that really was just a bunch of ranges connected. There really wasn't any more realism added to these ranges, or more nodes or anything like that. So DARPA kicked off a big program in 2008, 2009 timeframe that ended up becoming what we call now the National Cyber Range. And that had, this big research agenda that actually ended up getting pared down to this level. And really what came out of that, in my opinion, was the ability to scale these ranges. So now instead of having the cyber defense exercise back in 2001, we might have, less than 100 nodes on the network, all emulated in virtual machines. Now you can have 40,000 nodes on your network. And so allowed these ranges to scale. But again, it was focused primarily on emulating these machines, and there was very little simulation, and there was very little in terms of human interaction on these ranges, besides what the folks that were actually exercising were providing. So then, when I was at Cybercom, we worked with Carnegie Mellon on this environment called Step Forward, which was kind of a corollary to the DARPA Cyber Range. That introduced more things like content and specific modules for training, and also had a little more user experience in the range. But again, it required a lot of manual exercise participation. So we still had to bring on experts to role play users. We had to bring on experts to role play the adversary, and system administrators and so forth. So it's very manpower intensive. One of the other issues that we face with those types of ranges is that when we start trying to emulate physical devices, so it's pretty easy now in virtual machines to emulate operating systems and applications, but when you start trying to emulate routers, that gets really hairy. And so what we did with the Step Forward environment is we introduced routers in the environment, but then in order to separate exercise traffic with real-world traffic that the routers needed to communicate the exercise control information, we ended up having to create this really hairy VLAN configuration where, it was just ugly because you'd have to route packets through a router and then back to yourself and then out. It was really hairy just to set up and configure. And so being able to emulate physical devices on the network, such as routers or SCADA systems or things like that, get really challenging in these domains. And since that time, a couple states, Michigan and Virginia in particular, stood up cyber ranges, which are taking this to the next level. The Michigan Cyber Range, one of the things that they've done there that's kind of unique is they're actually emulating a city now. So you can go to their range and they have a environment that looks like, they call it Alphaville, a city with wastewater treatment plants and electrical utilities and mayor's office and the government office, and those are all now susceptible to being attacked or defended based on what the training scenario is. So that's kind of a brief history of where we've been on cyber ranges and where we're going. What I'd like to do is just point out where I think some of the gaps are here. So one of the things, when we talk about these ranges, they're really focused on emulation. They're using virtual machine technology to emulate nodes on the network. There really isn't a whole lot in terms of simulation in these ranges. And I always ask my question, is there a role for simulation in cyberspace ranges? I think there is, and I'll talk about it in a second, but right now, at least I'm not aware of any ranges that are really using a whole lot of simulation. There is a little bit of simulation on some cyber physical systems, and really it's emulating, in this case it's electric power generation. They're emulating some of the mechanical features, but that's really about the extent of it. The next thing is the focus in that history of cyberspace ranges has really been on scaling and increasing the realism of the logical layer of cyberspace. There's been really very little work in the physical and the cognitive cyber personal layers. And that's really unfortunate because we know cyberspace is made up of these different layers. So if you look at all the different computational components from a technology standpoint of what makes up cyberspace, from hardware out to cyber physical systems, really these ranges have focused in on the system software, the operating system software, and the application software. And typically for general purpose computing environments, so your Windows and Linux-based systems. There's very little work done on actual, for example, oftentimes in cyber we see a vulnerability introduced because someone brings a USB stick and plugs it into a computer. That's very rarely emulated or simulated in a cyberspace range. Another example from an insider threat perspective, a lot of times we might be able to simulate something from an insider threat perspective. For example, if I say, I'm the system administrator of UCF, and oh, by the way, today I'm going to bring down server 123 for maintenance, and if you're an insider and you have files on that server that you might want to exfiltrate before I bring that down, we could do that in a simulated physical environment where we're talking to each other, and then see if that actually induces you to actually go off and download those files. And so that right now is not being modeled for cyberspace training, at least not that I'm aware of. Yes.
How do you define insider threat?
How do I define insider threat?
How does cyber command, cyber defense?
Yeah. This isn't official position of Cybercom, but typically we think of an insider threat as someone who has some kind of access on the inside of a network. And that access can be either because the person has valid credentials on that network, such as you all have valid credentials on UCF network, so you could all be considered insiders if you did something malicious, or non-malicious, but something that caused a problem in that one. Or in my definition of insider threat, it could also be someone who does not have valid credentials, but has been able to gain valid credentials through other means, and is now basically being, emulating themselves as somebody else that's on the network, right? So if I get your credentials, I can now pretend that I'm you on this network, on the UCF network. So I would now become, in that case, a virtual insider, even though I might be controlling that from somewhere else.
Then how did that conflate an outsider? So how do you differentiate an outsider? Because that's exactly what an outsider will do, isn't it?
At some point, possibly, yes. But sometimes outsider threats are not necessarily, they don't always grab credentials to move laterally. They could, but they don't have to, right? They could gain root, or they could, there's other ways they could move laterally without getting credentials. I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, I mean, at some point an outsider might become an insider. Right? If I'm recounting your network, I'm still an outsider. In my definition, once I have your credentials, I am now pretending to be you. I am now an insider threat. And if I have behavior on that network that's not consistent with your behavior, then that ought to clue some system to know that, okay, something's amiss here.
Well, the reason I asked that question is one of the issues I see in looking at all the RFPs out there when they use the term insider threat. They tend to mean someone who is on the inside that has malicious purposes.
Right.
But I wager that's probably 1% of the problem when 99% of the problem are insiders.
Right.
None of the research I've seen is addressing the 99% problem. They're addressing the 1% problem.
Yeah. I don't know what the percentage is, but I would agree that most of the time when you read research about insider threat, they're talking about someone like you who has valid credentials who's doing something malicious. Not,
they're funding research to avoid the next Edward Snowden when they should be funding research to avoid the next idiot who
makes
downloads a message they shouldn't have
right.
downloaded.
Someone like clicks on a spear phishing attack. Right. Yeah, and so my definition, I would include both groups, plus I would include an outsider who gains insider credentials in my definition.
Right, but that's three definitions, but only one form of research being done.
Right.
So who's going to fix that?
I don't know. I'm not personally focused on that right now, but although we do have one research project with, actually, Dr. Is it Reinem? Reinem on that.
Right.
But it's more on your 1% case.
I know, and that's what I see as a huge gap and a huge problem.
Yeah, because in theory, if you can detect an insider who's being malicious, you ought to be able to detect an insider who's being just, not just making a mistake. But they have some kind of behavior that is outside the norm of proper behavior.
yeah, most of the grants and everything for the user training and awareness, that a lot of those are STEM related. So, you know, the audience is much younger than what you're talking about, Steve. So, you know, I think it's going to come around more, but they look at the people doing dumb things as a local issue, not realizing that it's everybody's issue, and that the government should try to do a little bit more. So what unfortunately their focus is not entirely, but most of that STEM. As if that's going to solve everything. Yeah.
But, yeah, so to go back to, really my point here though is that through the history of what we've done in cyberspace ranges, we focused on the logical layer. We really ignored this physical and cyber persona layer, which at least in the Department of Defense mind, we defined it as including all these different layers. And so this is where I think there is a role for simulation, especially in the physical, from a couple aspects. In the physical layer, simulating some of these embedded devices, simulating some of these hardware that it's very difficult without a lot of jury-rigging to put these into play on the networks. And then from a cyber persona layer, being able to emulate human behavior on the network. And that's where a lot of my research comes in with cognitive modeling and some things that we're looking into at my company. And then really the last issue that I've seen across the years with these cyberspace ranges is it just takes a lot of manpower to run them. So that DARPA National Cyber Range, they've got a full-time staff now that runs that down here somewhere, near here, I'm not sure where it is, somewhere around here. Lockheed Martin runs it. It's just very manpower intensive. And so if there's anything we can do to reduce that manpower footprint, that definitely would benefit the cyber mission forces and others. And I always go back to when I was a tank company commander, we had this thing called UCOF, the Unit Conduct of Fire Trainer, which was basically I could bring myself and my 3 other people in my tank crew, so 4 of us total, we could go into this simulator and we could practice shooting in this simulator, right? And it took one other person to run that, and that was basically our master gunner who just set the scenarios up for us to execute. My question is, where is that for cyber? It doesn't exist right now. I can't just, go, well, there's some things up there now that where I can go home on my laptop and work through some scenarios, but for the most part, that doesn't exist right now. So being able to create ranges that an individual can use to practice their skills, I think would be beneficial. And then, a range that is somewhat realistic. I mean, we've got, more than 100 nodes, but, less than 100,000 nodes. But it's got to have realistic user behavior in there too, adversaries, defenders, and so forth. Otherwise, it's just a dead range. If you look at the persistent, this is what the Department of Defense has come out with, and PEO Stride, which is right here. This is one of their slides that talks about this persistent cyber training area, or persistent cyber training environment. And if you go through and look at this, you really see that they haven't really thought about those logical or the physical and cyber cognitive layers. Right? They're talking about event planning, okay, great. Secure, reliable transport, okay, that's connection between ranges or connection between nodes, great. Distributed tailorable, fixed sites, okay, that's all about having facilities to train in, great. And then the environment, so it's focused on the environment. Creating an environment which mainly is logical devices. They talk about physical devices, but they really, well, I don't know how they plan on implementing that, and I don't know how much simulation they're really talking about there. And then when we get into traffic generation, we have traffic generators right now that generate traffic. The problem with them is anyone who is an expert in this field can immediately pick them up that it's not realistic behavior of a user or an adversary. And so creating realistic, creating traffic generator models where it looks like there's actually a human on the other side using it without having to include manpower to run that would be something of use. And that's really where I'm kind of focused right now in my research. Couple things that's coming up. So those cyber mission forces that we created, that was mainly for DoD networks and TCP IP networks. Another part of the military is looking at what do we need for cyber forces at the, what does a tank company need for cyber forces? From an Air Force perspective, what does a fighter wing need for cyber forces? From a Navy perspective, what do we need on ships to protect ships against attack and so forth? And those cyber forces are all, going back to what Bruce said, those are things that services need to think about and resource above and beyond this cyber mission force construct we created. And then employment of AI, that's really what I'm thinking about from my perspective. And so the shortfalls with these ranges, again, is there's really no human interaction without actually bringing manpower to the range. And so how do we create realistic cognitive models of users using the network, using social media? How do we create realistic cognitive models of defenders like system administrators and folks, network administrators who configure and maintain those devices? And then how do we create realistic models of the adversary so that there's a real live adversary that's trying to penetrate your network, that's modeled somehow in your system. Modeling the adversary's tactics, techniques, and procedures is another area I'm thinking about. So in these environments, how do we, the adversary is doing things at the logical layer. They're using a specific form of malware. They're using specific tools. There are certain configurations that they change. That's all great. But above that, there's a thinking person who has goals they're trying to achieve. It's not just random. They're trying to achieve something. And so being able to model that would be useful not just for training, but also for defense. Because if we can model that, we would have a better understanding of where they're trying to go next. If we can figure out where they're trying to go next, we can then better defend our internal systems. So, yeah, we're out of time, so that's really my last slide, too. This is what I hope to tell my kids someday. But, any questions?
Okay, so DoD has an air, land, and sea force, and now Homeland Security has an air, a land, and a sea force. What's Homeland Security doing about this, and how do they feel about DoD worrying about, say, power plants and power lines and network infrastructure?
All right, so this is where we get into authorities and policies, and some of the discussions that we've had over the past 10 years. Typically, the answer right now is Homeland Security is responsible for the security of those critical infrastructures that you're referring to. And they are the ones who, on a day-to-day basis, are overseeing the security of that. Where the Department of Defense would come into play would be if there is identified and attributed a known nation-state actor or non-nation-state actor with significant capability who has we've either identified they have intent or they've actually penetrated some of those systems. And then that's where the Department of Defense authorities would come into play and potentially move to a defensive posture.
The complication there is, my observation is that we're under pretty much continuous attack from nation states and individuals alike. How do we differentiate when we slip over into the overt attack event?
Right. So there's, it's difficult. I'm not going to say it's not. There's ways through intelligence to identify that we've slipped over. It's not always accurate, and it's not always, it's a hypothesis, right? Intelligence is typically, in my mind, a hypothesis. It's not a guarantee, right? We've seen that in the news. But at some point, yeah, there's a hypothesis that we have confidence that we've slipped over into something that requires more capability. This is where I think something like attack models of adversaries would be useful, because if we knew where they were at on the attack model, we would have a better understanding of when they've slipped over. If you think about it right now, when we say attacks, in the Department of Defense language, an attack has to be something that that denies in that temporal aspect. It has to disrupt, it has to degrade, or it has to destroy. Then it's considered an attack. So things like scanning a network, which is what most people in the press call an attack, is not necessarily considered an attack. Ransomware that's applied to a system that's contained and localized, may or may not be considered an attack. If it's taking down a hospital and it's localized to that region, unless and this is where we get into terms, unless it gets to a certain level, it's not going to be considered an attack. Taking down the power grid or a section of the country's power grid, I think most people would probably classify that as an attack. And now we're talking Department of Defense authorities at that point. But yeah, there's definitely difference of opinions at the national level on this. There's definitely discussions about how do you classify when something is slipped over from something that's pestering you to something that's, okay, this is, I don't want to say an act of war, but this is something that's in violation of our sovereignty.
So, sir,
It's tricky.
there's a range of severity where some kind of cyber threat could provoke a kinetic response from us.
Could. Yeah, we don't necessarily have to respond with cyber through a cyber attack. If someone takes down the Northeast power grid, that doesn't mean we have to respond with a cyber attack.
There's a political decision that has to be made too, so they can't go willy-nilly on stuff. So it goes all the way up.
And this is why with the Department of Defense, it's really important that we're looking, they are looking at now, I'm not there anymore, but they're looking at, it's a kinetic, non-kinetic response or defense. I mean, it's not just one or the other. Cyber is just a tool in the toolbox. And, yeah.
Question. Just trying to conceptualize this, because this is all brand new to me. So one need that you're seeing from the cognitive level is if you had the ability to have something which essentially could pass a Turing test, would you say, for an adversarial or blue force, red force Turing test, where you had something where you couldn't tell, but was behaving in a way that if you specifically tried to figure out is this a real person or not, you would be fooled. That would be a good thing.
That would be a good thing from a training perspective.
From a training, okay.
Or, even operational, there might be
perspective.
some autonomous things that you can do on an operation. But yeah, right now, from a training perspective, definitely. Because right now, the problem with training in this space is that it requires a lot of people, not just the people being trained, but you got to bring a lot of people.
I worked for a while in simulation where you could do semi-automated courses, and that was very, we'd have these helicopter pilots come in, but prior to that, the scenarios would take days of people, and it was still going. It still couldn't figure out that the tags, it couldn't respond. So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, even the kinetic domains, we're still aspiring to that.
Okay, so that's a good problem.
To that.
But it's a good theoretical problem. I have one more question, if nobody else. This is very, very general. It goes back to something Professor Fiore was asking. Without going into, obviously you can't, there's security issues, but in general, how would you classify, if God forbid we had to go on the offense, how well could we do in comparison to, adversaries? Because I wonder sometimes when you look at something like the terrorist e-signs, we still can't seem to keep the terrorists from using the internet to recruit. And, it's obviously something we want to do, and yet we still don't seem to. So I wonder sometimes, plus from the news, you always get the feeling that our adversaries are so much better at this than we are. So I just wonder what you think.
Well, I mean, everybody's building capability, not everybody, but many countries are building capability in this area. It's more, I guess my message there is it's more about having the capability to do something. You have to have the will, which is true of any type of war. And you also need the authorities and policy to execute that will. And you have to have those three things. But as far as, we built the internet, so we have some subject matter expertise on our home turf. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Doesn't mean other people don't.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
All right.